Hello and welcome to the latest installment in Helix Education's webinar series, COVID-19, the Roadmap to Fall 2020. Today we're talking about student and parent expectation management under the theme of keeping your marketing straight when the world goes sideways. Thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Sparky Mortimer. I'm the Associate Director of Creative Strategy here at Helix, and I'm going to be moderating our discussion today. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get into things. This is the 12th webinar that we've presented in this series. That's pretty incredible. And so if you've been with us for one or more of our webinars in the past, you'll know that there are a couple of things to be aware of. We are recording this session right now, and we will post this on our Helix Education YouTube channel. In the past, we've used Otter AI for a live transcript as the meeting is going on. It's being a little glitchy for us today, the wonders of technology, right? And so unfortunately, we aren't able to provide that live for right now, so we apologize for any inconvenience with that. We will still make a transcript available once we have posted this on YouTube. We are creative problem solvers, if nothing else, at Helix Education. So if you'd like a transcript, we'll be able to provide that a little bit later on. The Q&A function is still working though in Slack or in Zoom. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's an icon that says Q&A. At any time during the discussion today, you're welcome to click on that and submit a question. We've got a couple of questions ahead of time, so thanks for those. We will have a larger Q&A section at the end, but there are also going to be times in between sections today that we'll have questions as well. So don't feel like you have to wait for the end of the meeting to ask your question if you've got one. So again, as a reminder, we've been on this journey to fall 2020 altogether. This is the 12th webinar that we've had so far. We're going to continue through the month of August and perhaps longer as we continue to answer your questions about this online transition as we get closer and closer to fall 2020, thinking of short-term and long-term plans to deliver quality online instruction, as well as quality online enrollment marketing, and that's going to be our topic today. And so our presenters today are both fabulous, and not just because one's my boss and one I work with pretty much every day. Our first presenter is Andy Nelson. He's the Vice President of Marketing at Helix Education, 2+ decades of marketing experience and leadership, including the last several of those years at Helix, filling various roles prior to his current role as VP of Management. He was responsible for the innovation and implementation team at Helix. And so that involved looking at internal and external processes and procedures and projects and all sorts of things, and finding ways to optimize and improve them, not just for Helix's benefit, but for the benefit of our partner colleges and universities as well. Andy is not only a marketing professional when it comes to higher ed, he's also worked on the institutional side at higher ed prior to Helix. And so Andy, we are glad to have you. Be on the lookout for perhaps some folksy aphorisms, statements of belief as we go. Andy is quite well known for those, so no pressure, Andy. Our other presenter today, besides Andy, is Katie Van Hazelen. She is a senior content strategist for us at Helix Education. I've worked closely with Katie the entire time that she's been at Helix. She's one of my favorite people here, really well versed in marketing communication, audience segmentation, market research. Has really proved transformative for us at Helix in the way that we communicate with prospective students and keep them engaged all the way throughout their student journey. Those efforts culminated in Helix Education winning an award from Marketo. It's an Adobe company that deals with marketing automation. Thanks to Katie and our collective team's efforts in that vein, Helix was awarded the 2019 Orchestrator Award from Marketo, and so Katie has proved invaluable in many ways for us here at Helix. So I'm so excited for all of you to hear the kinds of insights and expertise that I get to hear every day working alongside Andy and Katie. So Andy, I'm going to turn the time to you to get us started on what we're talking about today. So Andy, take it away.
Well, thanks, Sparky. That's a lot to live up to. So hopefully we can fulfill some of that. Our goals for the brief time that we have here together are really pretty simple. We want to talk about some of the things that we have come to rely on pretty heavily during the last few months to better understand and manage our enrollment marketing. And we'll do that, of course, through the lens of COVID-19. It's a little difficult in a forum like this to know exactly what the audience is looking for, what the audience needs. But hopefully we'll give you a few things to think about, some ideas of ways you can improve, some things that you might want to consider shoring up, or even some proposals that you might want to take to the broader team. So our conversation is going to go something like this. Of course, if you have any questions along the way, please send them to us. As Sparky mentioned, there is a Q&A feature here in Zoom, and we'll do our best to cover all of the questions before our time here together is through. So to get us started, our working hypothesis for this webinar is quite simply this, that the basics still apply. So I'm sure that you have heard this quote or one similar to it. It's hard to know exactly who said it first. It was probably a Prussian general somewhere in the mid-1800s. Many have expressed similar sentiments. Mike Tyson even weighed in, the great philosopher Mike Tyson, weighed in on this and put his spin on things, commenting on an upcoming fight with Evander Holyfield when the reporter asked him about Holyfield's plan for the fight. And he reminded us that everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And so, however you want to look at it, the key is to start with a solid plan and a good foundation, but expect that things are going to change. So even when things are more ideal, things will change, but the key is to have a good foundation and a good place to start. So whether you subscribe to the 4 Ps, the 7 Ps, the 2 Cs, the 4 Cs, or even the 6 Cs of marketing, the important thing to remember is that even when things get a little nuts, the basics still apply. So don't throw away everything you know when the crisis comes. However you want to slice it up, stay focused on your audiences, your messages, and the modes of communication. When the full impact of COVID-19 really started to be felt, and we started as a world to shut things down, and specifically in the online or in the education space, we started to move things to online courses. There were a lot of people kind of at loose ends. Administrators wrestled with what to do and when to do it. And the Marcom folks were trying to sort out what all of these decisions meant to their various audiences and how best to communicate to those audiences. The advent of a crisis just simply isn't the time to develop systems and protocols. So a crisis like this will test those systems and put pressure on those processes that are already in place and highlight areas large and small that need some shoring up. And I won't belabor this point, although I could. There are a few things that we've had in place for quite a while, for years, most of them, that were absolutely essential during this time. The first thing that is critical is a well-defined funnel. So understanding the student journey and knowing exactly where the students are along the way is just absolutely critical for your communication strategies and your performance measurements. The use of this funnel and the nomenclature throughout your entire organization facilitates that internal communication and helps to eliminate confusion. One of the things that we just absolutely rely on are the definitions along the student journey. So that when I speak with somebody in finance, or I speak with somebody in enrollment, or anybody in the marketing team, when we use those definitions and terms, everybody understands exactly what we're talking about. And the funnel is fairly well defined. There's a great deal of minutia in the funnel. So we can cut things up and slice things up and get very granular, which is critical. No matter how well and how hard you've worked to define that funnel, if you don't have good data, if you're not feeding and tracking everything, you're really going to be hamstrung. Similarly, no matter how good your data is, if you don't have easy access to that data, timely management just simply is not an option. This is one of the most common issues that I've run across in my career. Most companies are far better at collecting the data than they are at accessing it, analyzing it, and putting it to work. So often to get to the information, you've got to find people in IT who can build reports, can query the database and pull stuff out, and then you got to figure out how to manipulate it and share it and visualize it. So this is a real must here. You got to figure out how to access that data And not just one or two people, but everybody in the company needs to be able to see this stuff and to analyze it and react to it in their own sphere. And finally, you're going to be asked to provide forecasts and projections. That's one of the inevitable things about life as a marketer. And we'll talk more about this in a minute. But the bottom line here is to make sure that you understand the assumptions in your marketing plan. Plans are full of all sorts of variables, and you got to know how all those variables work together in that original plan so you can make proper assessments moving forward. What happens when I pull this lever or that lever? Or when this metric changes, what's going to happen downstream? Understanding all of that at the outset is absolutely critical, because when things start moving fast, you need to know what you can rely on and what moves in relation to other things. So, if COVID-19 has highlighted some deficiencies in any of the areas above, now's the time to start tightening them up and working with the broader teams in your organization to get the resources you need. These basics are important all the time, so there's plenty of justification for putting the effort in based on the lessons that we're learning from this current crisis. So Katie's going to talk through some of the basics of external communication, specifically how we've approached marketing and communication thus far in COVID-19.
Great, thanks, Andy. So I am going to talk to you about our marketing strategies and how we approach messaging, but I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about how those tactics and understanding the basics have helped us market during the last few months as we plan our future efforts. But before I do that, I want to share a little bit of an experience with you that I think we've all probably had at one point in time. So if you'll just transport yourself to the yesteryears of early 2020, when we all were still cruising around on planes. Let's pretend we're back on that plane. You just got cozy and you're 10 or 15 minutes into your in-flight entertainment, and then your screen pauses and your audio cuts out because the pilot is making an announcement. And he goes, "Howdy folks, it's Captain Steve coming in from the cockpit." And he talks to you about a couple of things. It's usually something like where the flight crew is from and how his airline, whether it's Delta or United or SkyWest or Southwest, they all care about your comfort and your safety. And then he talks about my personal favorite, your current cruising altitude. Well, that's all well and good, but what I really want to know from Captain Steve are totally different things. I want to know when we're going to land. I want to know if the flight's going to be bumpy. I want to know when I'm going to get my Diet Coke and my Cheez-Its, right? And there's no disrespect to Captain Steve, he's doing his best, but the message that he's delivering at that moment doesn't feel relevant to my needs. So the next time he makes an announcement, I won't pay attention. I'll probably learn to start kind of paying less and less attention to poor Captain Steve up there. Now, I don't bring this up to dog on Captain Steve because he's doing his best and it probably gets a little lonely up there in the cockpit, but I do think this can be related to your marketing strategy, because at its core, good marketing is good messaging, and good messaging is good experiences. And if you don't speak to your audience in a way that they can understand it, and at times where they're receptive to it, then they're not going to pay attention. And ultimately, unless a message is relevant to the recipient, then it simply won't resonate. So how do you craft a message that will resonate, especially when you're up against the clock? That is the question of the hour. Now, before you dive into creating a new Facebook ad campaign, or before you start creating that letter from the president, you really ought to take a step back and understand the basics of a good strategy. Because regardless of whether you're marketing a new program or a COVID update, the basics will still apply. And there are really three things you ought to be considering whenever you're crafting that strategy. So the first question you should ask yourself is, what is your message? And what are you even trying to say? But more importantly, why are you sharing it? And also, what actions do you want that specific message to drive? And ultimately, the most important thing that you should be considering is what's in it for your user. So go back to the plane analogy. What is relevant to me is that this plane is safe and that my ride won't be bumpy. I don't speak altitude, but if Captain Steve is trying to tell me that 32,000 feet is the optimum cruising altitude because it's safe and it won't be bumpy, then that's your message. The second thing you really need to understand is who you're speaking to. I mean, when we speak in higher ed, we know that we have three kind of main audience segments. You've got your parents of students, you've got your students, and then you've got your stakeholders. But if you drill down, you'll start to find that there are many more layers to that. So of course you have your current students, but you also have your first term students, your first generation students. You have your students who are on academic probation. You've got your students who are about to drop. And then you can just, in this exercise, go on and on and on. And I don't bring this up to overwhelm you with options, but simply to point out that each of those audience members are unique from each other. And each segment of your audience needs something different from you. So it's worth spending some time to look at your audience segmentations and try to understand their mindsets. What are the barriers in their way? What are the emotions that they're feeling? Because ultimately, you'll understand what you want them to do, but you also need to understand what's preventing them from taking the action that you want. And when you understand that and you understand those barriers, you can create marketing that alleviates those barriers and ultimately leads to a good student experience. So the last tenet that you really ought to be paying attention to is your channels. Now, there are many channels that a marketer has at their disposal. We can send an email, we can send a text, you can shoot off a letter from the president or stick up a billboard. Now, the great thing and the fantastic thing about having so many options is that each of those channels works best for something, but not each of those channels works best for everything. So as a very, very basic example, if I need a prospective student to call admissions, I'm not going to write them a letter, I'm going to send them a text. So that may seem really obvious, but it's worth taking some time to consider how your audience interacts with and responds with the channels that you use. And then once you consider all of this, regardless of what you're up against, then you can move forward with an action plan to create a very impactful marketing strategy that will speak to your audience, that will serve them to meet their needs, and will ultimately provide them with a good experience and ally them to your institution. So let's talk a little bit about what this looks like in the real world and talk about how we've implemented this with our COVID marketing. So with our COVID marketing, we've kind of broken it up into a 3-stage approach. The phase 1 being the nitty-gritty. If you think back to early March, campuses all over the country were closing, and there was a little bit of panic, a little bit of confusion, and I think a whole lot of, is this really happening? And so what we needed to do was communicate exactly the situation and the immediate impact that this has to everyone in our funnel. And when you thoughtfully approach your message by going through the exercise that we just looked at on the previous slide, you can then thoughtfully tackle the challenge at hand, even if it's an unprecedented one. So phase 1 in communicating this needed to be quick. We needed to make it snappy because things were moving pretty quickly. But because we have a matrix, because we've created these matrices in the past, we can then easily dissect our audiences and approach them strategically. So what you see on the deck here are 3 examples of audience segments. Obviously, we could go a deeper dive. We can go into deeper audiences from here. But for the purpose of brevity, we'll just cover these 3. And I'll, as an example, kind of talk through how we would approach something like this for current students and their parents. So we know exactly what we need. We need to let our current students know what we're doing and the impact that it has on their education, even if there is no impact. Even if you're an online institution who is going to consider continue business as usual, students need to know that. We also know that there's going to be a fair amount of concern and worry going into this, so we need to get ahead of the problem and be available to address the concerns. Now we know, or at least can take an educated guess, that these current students are probably pretty worried about their progress. They or their children have just spent the last 6 months, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is, working on a degree, and now everything is up in the air. And they have questions like, how am I going to take my finals? Do I do my clinical experiences? So the way that we will counteract that is crafting a strategic message that says, this is our institution's response to this event, and these are the ways that we're going to help you. Now, because we're in a crunch and because we know the channels that work for this audience segment, we will tackle this through text and email. And one unique way that we went about this at Helix is by crafting a crisis communication strategy call chain, if you want to call it, something like that. Whereas we looked at our audience segmentation and we broke it into different populations, sent each of those populations a text that said something like, we know you're worried, your education is still on track, but we're going to call you so that we can talk about it. So those students were primed and ready to receive a call, which they did within an hour, and it was from somebody from the institution who was able to talk through their concerns and address it head on. By doing this, we were able to get ahead of the message and deliver the message that we really wanted to. Our COO, Kari, had hosted a webinar several weeks ago about crisis communication, and she said something along the lines of, if you don't tell the story, then students will start to tell their own. And something like this really comes in handy when you need to alleviate concerns and worry. So obviously we're talking about something that's happened in the past, but again, this doesn't have to be, we don't have to only look at this matrices when we're worried about something big. Something like this might happen or might be helpful for another big ticket item. For example, if you're going back to campus, what's your mask policy? What about when you launch a new program or have a change in leadership? Understanding and being empathetic to your audience's needs, regardless of what the situation is, will help you achieve your marketing goals. So we'll move on to phase 2 and talk about the second phase that we went through, which was kind of the near future. This is about 2 to 4 weeks after campuses started closing. What we needed to do was communicate where we're going from here. We know what's happening, but what does it mean to our audience? And so for this particular slide, let's take a look at prospective students who have submitted their application, but they haven't finished it, or they've been admitted, but they haven't quite registered. Again, what we need them to do is understand the impact, but more importantly, brass tacks, we need them to finish their application, or we need them to finish their admission process. So we're going to craft a message that answers the concerns and the mindset that they have at that time. We're going to tell them exactly how we help you finish. And we're going to use the channels at our disposal that we have the time to work with, because we have 2 to 4 weeks, and we know that audience responds to. So one way that you could look at this at your institution is by taking a look at the wireframe that you already have in place. Do you send a letter at point of application? Do you start an email cadence? Do you have somebody reach out and call a student? Whatever it is, take a look at what you're already doing, and then just tweak the messaging, tweak the copy to make sure that it's addressing things head on, like upcoming starts, modality changes. Again, COVID's impact on an application, even if there isn't an impact. By doing something like this, you're again getting ahead of the problem, but more importantly, all of the marketing channels that you're using are starting to tell the same story. Whether your applicant is looking at the text they just got, or they're reading the email somebody sent them, if they're looking on Facebook and they see an ad, or if they got a postcard in the mail, it's all about the same thing. It's all about how we can help them finish despite COVID-19. So let's go ahead and move on to discuss what we're doing now and kind of how we're moving into the new future, which is the long game, right? We know that this isn't shortly temporary. I mean, we hope it's not forever, but we need to communicate now how our institutions are poised exactly to meet the needs of this moment. And so we'll take a look at kind of prospective students for this. And when we say prospective students, we mean anybody who's pre-inquiry, who hasn't yet raised their hand, or maybe people and their parents who have inquired, but they haven't moved to that next step of applying. Obviously, we need them to submit their application, but there's a lot of big fish to fry at the moment. People are very concerned about a lot of things, mostly the economy. They're worried about their jobs, and they're also questioning, can I really go to a school online? So the way that we will change our marketing is by discussing just those things, how education will lead to job security. And also for us and the institutions that we work with, we can discuss quite a bit about how online is in the DNA. But if that's not the case, you can discuss how we put measures in place to ensure that you're interacting with your peers, to make sure that you have time with your professor, that you're using Zoom or Skype or whatever it is to emulate a real in-class experience so they can feel confident that they're going to get the education that they need. And of course, we're going to do this through all of the channels that we have available, because similar to phase 2, wherever a student or a prospective student is looking and wherever their parent is looking, we want to make sure that that same message resonates. Why this is important and why this is kind of a big strategic move for us is because right now, at this moment in time, everything needs to be topical. If you're a marketer, you know that pre-March 2020, it was tough to get somebody's attention. Well, now it's July 2020, and it's even harder to get somebody's attention. So everything we say needs to be relevant to the exact situation that people are in. And by addressing the concerns of our current and potential students, regardless of where we are in our marketing techniques, we can deliver marketing that speaks directly to them and also helps us achieve our goals. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into how we at Helix are working toward our goals. Sparky, I guess I'll turn the time over to you to see if we've had any questions that have come in that we can help address right now.
We've had a couple. One comes from Jenna. You ended really emphasizing this idea of messaging to prospective students. And Jenna asked, what are the most common problems you see in higher ed messaging to prospects? Can you give examples or themes that you see in the market? And so what would you say to Jenna in that case, Katie? And Andy, if you want to weigh in as well.
Sure. So I think one thing that we need to be cognizant of is creating messaging that's very much about the institution and not about the student. And so I think that, I think of messaging as kind of a Venn diagram. You have the institution right here, and then you have the student right here, and somewhere in the middle is where your message aligns with them and serves them. And so I think when we look at things like, and our message is, we've been doing online for 20 years, then we need to be really cognizant of how that applies to the prospective student and what they can gain from it. Because otherwise, it's very much an us, not you message, if that makes sense. Andy, do you have anything to add to that?
I would add only that's really where understanding your audience and having good data to be able to segment and understand, if they visited your web properties, what pages, what things were they interested in, and what else can you glean from them based on their behavior, so that you can provide relevant messages to them. It's the information, the insights we have on any given inquiry are pretty scarce, and obviously if you move further up to the top of the funnel, we know very little. So to the extent that you can, understand who you're speaking to and tailor that message so that, as Katie said, not only is it relevant to them, but it's also not just the shotgun approach, because there are things that are going to matter to different people at different times. So that ability to segment your audience is crucial right from the outset, right from the beginning interactions with your prospects.
Yeah, excellent. So thank you, Jenna, for that question. Thanks, Katie and Andy, for your answers. And we had a question that came in ahead of time that I think we could piggyback off this one really well. And it was, what guidance did you give your teams about messaging? And so, Katie, I think you touched on this a bit, but just any other insights from Katie or Andy about the guidance that we at Helix received about messaging, both across these different matrices and segments like you were talking about, Katie?
Yeah, and I'll touch on a couple, and Katie, you can bring up some points too, because I know this was a conversation fairly early on. And one of the things that happened early was our enrollment marketing manager sent out an email just to everybody, just kind of a general reminder to understand that COVID-19 is now the backdrop for everything that we say and do, and people will be viewing it through that lens. So be sensitive to that, and make sure you kind of read the copy and look at the images in that light. Also, there's some reminders about understanding that when we have a lot of messages out in the market for campus-based learning, well, all of a sudden that's going to be something that we need to make sure that we are revising to focus on the online modality, because that's what's going to be available. And there were a few other tips that came from that. Katie, what would you add?
I would add that, again, we want to be sensitive and tactful in our approach. I think that being careful in this moment about what's going on in the world is important. I think that you can easily do that by ensuring, you can easily make sure you're not being predatory by kind of speaking truth to advertising and speaking about what we know to be true. We do know that there's people, regardless of what's happening in the world, education will help you with job prospects. I think that you can also frame it in a way that people can understand. And I think you can also call upon people within your institution who can help deliver the message in a sensitive way. So I think that's a roundabout answer, but in terms of messaging, that I think was the guidance that we took, is ensure that we're sensitive and tactful while still addressing the common concerns that people have.
Yeah, and to reiterate some of the things that Katie brought up earlier, understanding the different messages for your different audiences is pretty important. If I'm a student that is beginning the enrollment process, what I need to know is what's going to happen because the campus I was going to go to is closed. But if I have yet to really begin that process, if I'm still sort of looking around, I just want to know that you know how to handle online learning and that you can provide and you're set up to continue. So really, again, understanding who you're talking to is a big piece of that, and being able to reassure them or encourage them, as the case may be, or their consideration committee, their influencing committee, to make sure that we understand and we know what's going on is pretty important. But it varies significantly depending on where you are on the funnel.
All right, excellent. Great insights, Katie and Andy. Thank you. Ryan has a question. What is an enrollment coach? On the screen there, we say the message, call your enrollment coach. So enrollment coach is a term that we at Helix and our partner institutions use to refer to admissions representative, enrollment representative. The role of an enrollment coach is to take that prospective student from the time that they first inquire till the time they are registered for classes and start their first day. And that enrollment coach is with that prospective student all the way through that period. And so helping them to complete their application, securing any transcripts that are needed, help giving direction on financial aid, completing a FAFSA, coordinating with the institution on matters such as those, and basically kind of whatever else that prospective student needs to get ready for that first day of class. And so other institutions may use something like admissions rep or enrollment rep, but yeah, that's how we define what an enrollment coach is. So thanks, Ryan, for that question. We've had a couple more questions that I think are going to be addressed pretty well in our next section as we talk about internal communication and expectation management. So Anne has a question of how can we effectively communicate the need for this type of communication strategy to administration. And Katie asked, not you, Katie Van Hazelen, but Katie O'Hare, asks, Andy talked about data collection throughout the funnel. Does he have a recommended template of data points to measure? Also, in terms of planning, is there a marketing calendar template that you recommend to share your plan with others? So I think that's a great segue into our next section on internal communication and expectation management. So Andy, I will let you run with it from here.
Sure. And Sparky, there's a lot there. And some of it I know we cover, but we may need a reminder to make sure we touch on all of those points. So if you would kind of help keep score, I would appreciate it.
I got you.
So at the same time that you're trying to manage all the external communications, there are internal constituents that are looking to you for guidance, not only regarding the execution of the strategies noted above, but also things like spend and top of funnel performance. So we'll talk a little bit about all of that, but quick note on some of the numbers you're about to see. I've removed any of our partner identification, and I don't really even use the same partners in every example, but they are real data points. So you can kind of do with that what you will, but these refer to no specific partner. So one of the first things, the first pieces of internal communication you have to worry about is to the teams that are handling the message creation and the message dissemination. Having a clear documented plan that you follow regularly is critical at a time like this, because you don't want to skip any steps, take any shortcuts that are going to lead to problems down the line. You can really get tripped up by the anxiety to get things done quickly. And like I said earlier, a crisis isn't the time to develop a process. However, there are things you can learn from your time in the crucible. For instance, we've refined our process so that at the discretion of the account manager or subject matter expert, and in specific situations, we can waive the initial kickoff meeting and let the written spec be the guide. It seems like a small thing, but it can shave hours off of a project. Now, I didn't take the time to kind of lay out our entire internal creative process, but it is a detailed and thorough process that is managed by our account management team, and we use a work-a-jig, a tool to help kind of process and keep things moving, but it's all very clearly defined, and we use it all the time, not just in an emergency, so that when something like this happens, everybody knows exactly what to do. And in this case, we created a little out to speed things along a little bit. We also made some process changes around webinars. Surprise, surprise. We'd had a process for doing webinars, but this accelerated pace has encouraged us to make some changes. And what we did was we separated out some of the elements and put them on parallel paths rather than on a linear track, thereby decreasing the overall time from start to launch or start to webinar. So if you haven't already defined and use regularly a process for creative and messaging, take the lessons that you've learned from COVID-19 and create one. If you do have one, now's a good time for a lesson to learn debrief to identify ways you might want to improve. The other important line of communication is all around performance and marketing spend. Everybody from enrollment to finance is anxious and looking for guidance. So the best guidance that we can generally give comes from some form of comparative data. So taking a look at your year-over-year, month-over-month, and even day-to-day trends can provide some pretty valuable insights. So this is a basic, or here's where the basics of a well-defined funnel and clean data really pay off. When we're looking at the data, and I'll try not to bore everybody with all the numbers that we get to play with, we're looking at it in either in terms of when the inquiry was generated or received, or when the student moved into a particular status like submitted applicant or completed applicant. So we're talking about coming from the received data or when they change their status. Looking through the received date lens, we can see critical top of the funnel activity and get a sense of how consumers are behaving based on the day they arrived in our system. Because we wanted to share this info with a lot of the other people around the organization so they could see it, so they could help interpret it, we created a quick Google Doc. And what you're seeing here are just some screen grabs from a few of the graphs that we put in this Google Doc. And we added the little slicers at the top in orange so that we could control better for things like changes in the media mix, and we could also alter the date range. So this, you can look at several months at a time, several days at a time. You could look at all channels, some channels. And this view also gives us the year-over-year and month-to-month and day-to-day kind of comparison. So we created a separate graph for each of the top of the funnel steps to make for a quicker assessment of how things are moving through the funnel. We focus on these steps, raw to submitted applicant. Those are the ones that we most commonly look at from a marketing perspective, although we look at the entire funnel. But we tend to look at everything from raw to submitted. So we won't go through the whole funnel. I think we've already done that. But that's things like raw and contacted, or raw and scrubbed and contacted and qualified up to submitted applicant. Because all of those things tend to happen fairly quickly, and they provide a good early indication of how our marketing dollar is performing. So if you take a look at these numbers, you can see at the beginning of the month, we're really down year over year. This is back in March. We're down in qualified inquiries year over year, but if you look at submitted applicants, you see a different story. So you have to watch the entire funnel. You can't just focus on either end of the funnel, because you're gonna miss important trends and you're gonna miss opportunities to react to what you're seeing. As I mentioned, the other way that we look at things typically is by the status start date. So on any given day, how many students moved into a specific status like qualified inquiry or submitted applicant? This perspective gives valuable insights as it speaks to the quality and the performance. So how engaged are the inquiries and how are we doing at moving them along? This is a view that our enrollment ops folks find particularly useful as they evaluate and forecast future starts. So they're less concerned about when an inquiry was received and much more concerned with the volume of a given status relative to the next start. So if we're 120 days out from the start, we need to have X number of submitted apps and Y number of completed apps if we're going to reach our new start goal. We also put together some other bar graphs and things like that that show sort of the aggregate by month as another quick way to see how these things are coming together. Now, of course, not all this stuff is happening in a vacuum, and the use of key ratios is also pretty important. And the one that I wanted to touch on a little bit here today is the cost per ratio. And typically, folks like to think of cost per only in terms of cost per inquiry, sometimes cost per start. But by extending that all the way through to each of the steps, you can really start to see some things that are important. It's impossible because you can't really judge performance just on volume or just on cost. So this cost per ratio is a good way to get a gauge overall, and at a pretty granular level. You can look at things by cost per, by channel, by ad group, and even keyword when we're talking about search, and use that to guide your marketing decisions. Of course, this is one set of ratios. The whole conversion rate is another set of ratios that are obviously critically important, but I think cost per tends to get ignored a lot, especially all the way through the funnel. And this became critical for us in the COVID-19 lens, or through the COVID-19 lens, when we saw big advertisers in verticals like travel were dramatically reducing their spend. I mean, they were just pulling out of all kinds of stuff. And a quick check of our cost pers from those channels helped us evaluate how we were seeing the impact of that. So are we, in fact, they're getting out? Does that mean there's more inventory for us? Does that mean we can spend more money? And if we do spend more money, how is that going to equate into new inquiries and ultimately new starts? So we can use that cost per ratio to see what's going on and see if we should put more money into specific channels. Similarly, cost per was a really good way to gauge the impact of the dramatically increased activity that we saw around search terms like online school and learning online. So I forget the statistics, but it was hundreds of times more search terms or queries to the search engines for those kinds of terms. The big surge in all that, though, was largely from parents and K-12 teachers who were frantically trying to find resources and figure out what to do with their kids. So it was important for us to understand how this was impacting our campaigns. And sure enough, we saw our cost per raw inquiry, so tip top of the funnel, we saw our cost per raw inquiry start going up on those more generic terms, those more generic campaigns. So we needed to make some adjustments, or else we would just be spending money on things that weren't really going to ever pan out for us. So that early warning signal prompted us to reduce that spend until things settled down some. So understanding these ratios and looking at them all through the funnel is pretty important. And again, I think cost per is one that, especially at the granular level and all through the funnel, tends to kind of get overlooked. So it's impossible to say if we are truly in the new normal or if we're just kind of at a slower portion of the transition to the new normal. Only time's going to tell that. But things do seem to have settled down just a little bit. And we are looking at this at Helix as a good time to shore things up. I think in the crush of the everyday and the desire to get things done, we often forget that taking time to sharpen your saw is also part of the work. So, Sparky, I hope that counts for the folksy aphorism. But taking time to make sure that you're working effectively and to tighten up the tools that you're using is really critical. And so we're looking at this and we're doing a lot of lessons learned and a lot of introspection to kind of figure out how we can be better always, but especially the next time something like some kind of crisis happens. We're testing new messages and looking for different and new ways to engage with our audiences, both internally and externally, on the matters that are important to them right now. And that whole marketing mantra of the right message for the people, it's important internally and externally as well. So Sparky, remind me of the broader questions that we want to touch on.
Yeah, so the first half of Katie O'Hare's question, recommended template of data points to measure, I feel like we've covered that. The second half of Katie's question and then Ann's question are kind of two sides of the same coin, just in terms of, Katie asked, is there a marketing calendar template you recommend to share your plan with others? And Ann talked about how can we effectively communicate the need for this type of communication strategy to administration. And so what ways to share this with other decision makers and other folks like that?
Sure. So let me touch quickly on the data one, although I know we covered it. I think the key to this is working within your internal teams and within your internal systems to figure out how granular you can force things to be. We kind of several years ago sort of unpacked everything, took it all apart and put it back together. And a lot of what was there was usable, but we just kind of reordered it or reconfigured it, so we could see that entire funnel. So I would recommend that you figure out what are the steps. And when you get this slide deck, you'll see the list of those steps, and those are the big milestones, and there are lots of substeps under that. But take that time, and it is a process to define the entire student journey and make sure you understand the ins and outs of it. Once you have that, then you get into you can get better into the whole idea of a marketing calendar and lobbying for those internal mechanisms. Broadly speaking, and Katie, you get ready to jump in on this, but broadly speaking, the way we look at our marketing calendar is based on when the start date is. And because we have lots of good data, we know the average time or the average distance from the start that inquiries come in to contribute to that start. So if the start is on September 1st, we know that really, because it takes 45 to 60 days to get the entire process done, that the cutoff point for contributing to that September 1 start is going to come sometime 45, 60 days prior to September 1. So that area before that is the recruiting time. And the calendar is really driven by that start date. And then each inquiry has kind of its own calendar. So you come in and this happens to you on day one. And sometimes, well, Katie can, if you really got time, we can go into what happens like at minute one and then, hour one. But it goes all the way through so each individual follows their own process and their own communication. And that again is based on behavior. So if you do this, then we will respond thusly. If you don't do anything, we'll do this. So really it's all about timing from the start. But then once you come into the system, everybody kind of has their unique and individualized calendar and messaging based on kind of what they're doing and where they are. Katie?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that, that's the way that we segment our audiences is to ensure that the messaging for somebody who is in their final stage of the application process, it's a very different message and approach than somebody who's in the kind of prospective portion. And so to Andy's point, yep, we do make sure that we're taking a look at our data and look at the funnel. And if we know, if we notice that last year, people took 62 days to get from A to Z, and now they're taking 45 days. That's data that we can use to kind of craft things and create proactive strategies to address those.
Yeah, I just can't say enough about how important having the data and collecting the data and then having access is. It is everything in this conversation.
All right. I see multiple thank yous from Katie. So I think we're feeling good, and she's feeling good too. So Katie, thanks for that question. We're into the broader Q&A, and so we've got time for a couple more questions. We have a couple in the Q&A already. If you joined us a little bit late, the Q&A icon is there at the bottom of your screen, and you can use that. Jenna had a follow-up question talking about the importance of the funnel. She says, but it feels like the funnel is changing with the shift to virtual events, prospects can't attend college fairs, etc. And so how do you recommend that institutions think about adjusting their funnel and their metrics as we see these kind of changes in the funnel happen? So Andy, Katie, what would you say to Jenna in that case?
I guess I would challenge that a little bit in that I don't know that the funnel necessarily is changing, but the behaviors may be changing, especially when you look at channels. Like I would say, you know, a recruiting fair or a student fair, that is a particular channel. And that behavior, no question, is going to change. So, but the basics of the funnel, the backbone of the funnel, all pretty much stays the same. But when I look at channel performance, that's going to change over time. So then the question becomes, okay, if we used to have a lot of success from events, we've got to replace that somehow. That's one thing to discuss. The other thing to discuss is, you know, these event providers, they're also trying to figure out how to replace live events. So what are they doing? How do we get in on that? How do we make that effective? And then it's a process of testing, trying, measuring, and seeing what happens. So, but that's true of any time you're talking about branching into a new channel or a new subset of a channel. And that routine, the rigor around testing, is another one of those things we didn't really get into a whole lot today, but that is an absolutely critical piece of the puzzle too. There always has to be some prospecting going on. What about this? Can we try this? What happens if we go into this channel or massage our current efforts in a given channel? So I do agree that there are things that the landscape is changing and has changed. So now it's a question of trying things to recover and to react in that new world. But I think when I think of the funnel, I think of very, very defined students move from raw inquiry to scrubbed, to contacted, to qualified, and all the way down to clearing census and first day of class. Katie, anything you want to throw in there?
I agree. I think that your milestone markers still probably aren't going to change. It seems like a lot of the time the modality in which we kind of push people through the funnel might change, right? But I do think tangentially it's a good opportunity for us to revisit the strategies that we were doing 6 months ago and see how we might modernize and make them again relevant. I know I've said that term four or five times already. And I think maybe if I say it one more time, an ad appears, I don't know. But if you're focusing on what's relevant, if people really are hungry for webinars, then serve them a webinar. If they really want to have a one-on-one Zoom session with an admissions rep, then that's something that we could consider as well. So, I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily an answer, but I think that things are changing, and I think that there are going to be some things that come out of it because it will some good things that come out of it because it will kind of force us to all modernize and rethink things through a different lens.
Yeah, and that, you know, there have been pretty significant shifts in the education landscape from a marketing perspective. You know, before these things happen for lots of different reasons. I mean, 15 years ago, in the adult education space, especially, affiliate marketing was huge. Now, that is almost an irrelevant channel. So the quest for marketers is always to be on the lookout for new, different, better ways, and the only way to get there is to test. And I think we as marketers owe it to our institutions to not be trapped by history. And you know, this always used to work, so we assume that it's always going to work. I think that's a danger. And so I would hope that some portion of every budget is carved out for testing, some portion of the human effort The human time is also carved out for scouting things out and testing things out, because that's the only way to really stay in the forefront and stay relevant, because you can bet our consumers are changing, and the people we're trying to communicate with, they're changing and they're moving fast. So we owe it to everybody to keep up.
All right. That sounds great. We have about 5 minutes left. And so just really quickly, we'd like to just kind of wrap up by sharing a lot of the resources that are available to folks that Helix Education is making available to colleges and universities as they transition to a quality online experience. And so again, if you've been with us before, you've heard these sorts of things before. If this is your first webinar with us, first of all, welcome. Second of all, as we approach fall 2020, we help our colleges and university partners to make this transition. We've couched it within these 4 pillars: this idea of institutional online readiness, the online teaching and learning experience, online student experience and engagement, and then the pillar that we've talked about today, student and parent expectation management. And so how Helix Education can help across these different ways is that we have assembled a collection of professional development resources, templates, KPI documents, all sorts of things to help aid you in this transition. They're available right there. helixeducation.com/new-future. We'll put that URL in the chat as well, so you can get a chance to click that. You'll also find webinars like this one, as well as the past webinars that we've done, as well as podcasts, other professional development opportunities, as I talked about, within those 4 pillars. And so anything that you'd like to get a little bit more emphasis on, you're welcome to go to the website and do that. We also have an email address set up. And so anybody who is looking for more information about your specific situation, feel free to shoot us an email at newfutureinfo@helixeducation.com. We've also put that email address in the chat for you to copy and paste in and let us know. Like we said at the beginning, we are continuing on the road to fall 2020. And so we have more webinars coming up in the weeks ahead. The plan now is to go through August, but we'll continue these for as long as you out there feel that it's necessary and that we can help you out. And so just a quick preview of other topics that we have coming up. The topics all relate week by week to those 4 pillars that we mentioned earlier. And so each week we'll focus on a different pillar. And so, like I said, this week fell under the student and parent expectation management pillar. And then next week is institutional online readiness. And so you see that those are our weekly areas of focus and themes as we progress through the month of August. And so just one last time, we're going to put that URL up there on the screen, as well as the email address. And so feel free to use and download those resources available at helixeducation.com/new-future. And send us an email if there's anything more that we can dig into, newfutureinfo@helixeducation.com. Thanks to everybody for attending. Thanks for your questions. And especially thank you to Katie and Andy for your insight and expertise that you shared with us today. For everyone out there who joined us, have a great rest of your day and week. Stay safe, and we hope to see you at more webinars in the future. So take care and have a great rest of your day and week.